We're starting this demo where we left off previously, but I removed the external login provider Windows for myself from the user store. And I gave the user who logs in using my Windows credentials another email address. This will make sure we've got a non-matched Windows user. Let's open the custom user service. In Authenticate External Async, we'll need to add one thing. We need to make sure that when a user is not matched to an existing email address in our user store and he's using Windows authentication, we're going to ask him or her for additional information. To redirect the user to a custom page, we should create an authenticate result, passing in the URL to redirect to and the external identity. This is the partial login functionality at work. Remember from the first demo where we set the authentication result on the context that, depending on which constructor overload we'd use, we'd either signify a full login, an error, or a partial login? Well, by using this constructor, we're stating that the user is partially logged in. He has to complete additional tasks before achieving a full login. That additional task, in this case, is filling out extra information on the complete additional information view. After the task has been completed, we'll redirect to this method. So as we're going to redirect somewhere, we'll have to create that page. Let's add a controller first. Let's name it Complete Additional Information Controller. And there we go. What else do we need? This is standard MVC, so we're going to need a model class to pass to the view. This model class should contain the values we want the user to input. So let's add that. And let's name it Complete Additional Information Model. Just as when we created a new user account from a registration link, we'll also include a list of items to show in the drop-down box. Like that, we can let the user choose his subscription, which will match to a role, free user or paying user. Additionally, we're going to ask him to input the first name and last name. Then let's add the view. And let me paste that in. This should look very familiar. It's almost the same as when we wanted to create a new user, be it with a few less fields. We're no longer asking for a password or username as the user is logging in using his Windows credentials. On to the controller. What we want to do before returning the view is ensure we have a partial sign-in. To get the partially signed in user, we can call the getIdentityServer partial login async method. To allow for that, we need to add a using statement to use the extension methods from identityserver3.core.extensions. If we have a partially signed in user, we can return the view, passing in an instance of the model we just created. Up next is the method that will be called when the user presses the register button on our view. Let me paste that in and then we can run through it. We again check if we have a partially signed in user. If we don't, we show an error page. If we do, we can continue. What we want to do in this method is register a new user and add the external Windows login to the login providers of that new user. So we first add that user login. Then we add the email claim, which we get from the partially signed in users claims collection. And then we can create claims from the model. Give a name, family name, and the role. Lastly, we add the user to the repository, which will effectively save it. Note that it might look tempting to say, well, if we're creating a page where the user can input additional details, why not match on an inputted email address rather than on one that is returned from the external identity provider? Well, we could do that, but it opens us up for security risks. After all, nothing is stopping anyone from inputting another user's email address here, which could possibly link the current Windows identity to an existing user that isn't you. So the claim we match on should not be one that can be freely inputted, at least not without additional validation. After having added the user to our user store, we continue where we left off by redirecting to the partial login resume URL. We get that by calling the getPartialLoginResumeURL async method on context.environment. That will redirect us back to the authenticate external async method. And this time, the user will exist in our user store. Let's give that a try. We're in our authenticate external async method. There isn't a user with a matching email claim, and the external identity provider is Windows. So we'll be redirected to the complete additional information page. Let's fill that one out. We're registered and we're back in the Authenticate External Async method. This time, the user should be in our repository. We find an existing linked user for kevin.docs@someprovider.com, the email address I inputted at our WS Federation server. Let's continue. And there we go, we're now logged into our application with a new user account with one external provider, Windows. And yes, the same principle could be used to improve on automatically giving a new user who logs in with Facebook for the first time the option to choose his role. You can also use these principles to override existing claims with claims from an external provider, even letting the user choose which claim is the correct one, and so on. By combining what we learned up until now about external providers and custom user services, all of that can be achieved. There's another interesting method we want to look into, Post-Authenticate Async, and that's the one we're going to cover next. We're going to implement two-factor authentication.